Buckingham Palace fell silent that afternoon. Staff were dismissed, and the doors closed behind Queen Elizabeth and Princess Catherine. What happened in that final, private meeting remains one of the monarchy's most closely guarded secrets until now. It was only days before Queen Elizabeth's health began its very public decline, but within the palace walls, something far more ominous had already begun. On a gray morning that seemed like any other, royal schedules were quietly adjusted. But one entry stood out. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was summoned alone. No Prince William, no press. No royal aides allowed in the chamber, just her and the Queen. To most, it may have seemed a standard private engagement between the monarch and her beloved granddaughter-in-law, but Princess Anne would later reveal it was anything but ordinary. She recalled the unsettling stillness in the Queen's stride, the formality of her attire, not her usual pastels or ceremonial blues, but a deep, somber black dress rarely seen outside of funerals. It wasn't the wardrobe of a sovereign upholding tradition. It was the attire of a woman preparing to speak her final truths. The meeting took place in one of the palace's most secluded and rarely used rooms, a space typically reserved for only the most private, royal deliberations. No portraits, no windows open to the outside world. Only silence, aged walls, and words that would never be forgotten. The Queen had chosen her stage, and what she was about to say had been rehearsed for months in her own mind. When Catherine finally emerged, her face betrayed something the public had never seen before. Her usual grace and poise remained, but underneath it was something else. An emotional tremor, a kind of internal storm raging just behind her eyes. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't linger in the palace, but within the hour, she had reached out to William in what sources described as a highly emotional call. Not even he was told the full truth of what transpired. That detail, the full contents of the Queen's final conversation, would remain locked away inside Catherine. Until Princess Anne, standing just outside the room that day, began to break the silence years later. Anne had never intended to speak. She had stood silently in the corridor, listening to the soft murmur of voices that rose and fell, then paused, then rose again, stronger, as if something deeply personal had been confessed and received with trembling hands. Her mother's voice, she would later recall, was not that of a monarch, but of a grandmother desperate to secure a legacy the world was not ready to face. But what Catherine was told in that final hour wasn't just a farewell. It was a command from a monarch who knew she was dying and who feared what was coming next. The Queen had spent decades supporting Camilla publicly, but behind the throne, she harbored silent doubts. What Catherine learned that day was that Camilla was never meant to carry the crown. It was perhaps the greatest paradox of Queen Elizabeth's reign, one she carried quietly to her final days. To the world, she extended grace to Camilla, even elevating her publicly, gradually restoring an image battered by years of scandal. But beneath the royal veneer, behind palace walls and guarded expressions, Elizabeth remained deeply conflicted. Private journals later confirmed what few dared to suspect. The Queen questioned whether the public would ever truly embrace Camilla. The applause at ceremonies, the headlines in the press, it all rang hollow to her. In quiet entries scribbled late into the night, she often wondered if time alone had numbed the outrage rather than healed it. And worse still, she feared that the crown itself, after her departure, might fall into hands that did not reflect its true spirit. Princess Anne, emboldened by her mother's final confidences, would later reveal that Elizabeth wrestled with the difference between personal affection and institutional responsibility. The Queen did not hate Camilla. That was never the story. But she was tormented by the weight of her own legacy. To Elizabeth, Camilla represented a compromise, a necessary arrangement to secure peace within the family, but not the image she envisioned for the monarchy's future. And that image mattered, not just to her, but to the nation she had served tirelessly for over 7 decades. One of her most private fears centered around Charles himself. The Queen had watched, sometimes helplessly, as Camilla's influence grew steadily stronger over the years. Charles, always emotional, increasingly leaned on Camilla not just as a partner, but as a political ally, a decision-making voice, and in some moments, the dominant figure in their royal tandem. It disturbed Elizabeth more than she ever let on. In whispers to Anne, she described a slow erosion of balance of tradition being bent under personal desire. She feared that after her death, Charles's heart might overrule his judgment. And Camilla, emboldened, might claim a crown never meant for her head. Catherine, by contrast, had earned the Queen's trust through her silence, her discretion, and her steady devotion to duty. In that final meeting, Elizabeth had not only warned her of what might come, but made her the quiet sentinel of royal preservation. She was chosen not because she asked for power, but because she never had. That, to the Queen, was the mark of someone worthy to protect the soul of the crown. What was said in that hour was meant to stay sealed, but Camilla was never supposed to find out. Yet word travels quickly in the palace, and when Camilla learned after the Queen's passing that such a meeting had taken place without her knowledge, her reaction was nothing short of volcanic. Aides reported slamming doors, a tirade behind closed chambers, and a demand to know what had been said. But there was no answer, only silence. And it was that silence, sharp, deliberate, and unwavering, that sent Camilla reeling. But the Queen hadn't just unburdened her soul. She made a secret request that would alter the future of the monarchy in a way no one expected. In a moment of trembling hands and misted eyes, Queen Elizabeth extracted a vow, one that Catherine had never intended to speak of again, until Princess Anne broke her silence. The atmosphere in the private chamber had shifted from regal formality to something almost sacred. The Queen, no longer speaking as a sovereign, was speaking as a woman burdened by truth, haunted by time, and driven by duty she could no longer carry herself. Her words weren't about policy or protocol, they were about morality, legacy, and the perilous future of a monarchy she feared was drifting off course. She didn't ask Catherine to be obedient. She asked her to be brave, to act not as a servant of the institution, but as its silent guardian. There was no illusion about what that meant. To protect the crown from within meant standing firm when others faltered, even if it meant opposing family. With her voice nearly breaking, Elizabeth handed Catherine a sealed envelope. The royal wax glinting on its surface wasn't just symbolic, it was a safeguard. Inside, the Queen had placed handwritten documents, warnings, directives, confessions. They were never meant for public eyes. Not yet. Not until the time came. A time, she feared, that would arrive much sooner than anyone realized. Catherine accepted it without question. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for clarity. She simply nodded, knowing that this wasn't a choice, it was a command cloaked in love. Years later, it was Princess Anne who confirmed what no one else could. She had stood just outside the door, listening to the Queen's voice tremble with urgency. And it was Anne who bore witness to the moment when Catherine, deliberate, steady, and with tears threatening to fall, swore to uphold the Queen's dying wish. This wasn't political theater. It was generational reckoning. The Queen's parting words would echo forever. Not all crowns are earned, some must be removed. A warning, or a prophecy. Since that day, Catherine has never spoken of the meeting. But those close to her noticed the change, the quiet resolve, the sharper gaze during official meetings, the unmistakable tension when standing beside Camilla. She kept the envelope close, reportedly stored in a private royal vault under her personal watch. And not once has she opened it in front of anyone, not even William. Yet the Queen's final request would become a ticking time bomb, one that Catherine could not contain forever, especially as Camilla's coronation approached. Behind royal smiles and tight-lipped diplomacy, Anne and Camilla's Cold War was intensifying. What the public never saw was the decades-long resentment and the final blow about to land. From the very beginning, Anne's acceptance of Camilla had always been conditional, cordial in public, but distant in spirit. She saw through the charm, the reinvention, the carefully managed public image. Where others in the family chose to adapt, Anne chose to remember. She had stood beside her mother through decades of reign, sacrifice, and tradition. In Anne's eyes, Camilla had not earned her place. She had maneuvered her way into it. And now, with Queen Elizabeth gone, Anne saw a crown being reshaped by someone who had never paid the full cost of its weight. While others danced around ceremonial roles and speeches, Anne quietly took control of what she could. Private moments, previously unseen by the public, revealed a subtle but deliberate power play. Invitations to certain events stopped, including Camilla's name. Seating arrangements shifted. Camilla's access to specific ceremonial privileges, long considered untouchable, was suddenly blocked, often without explanation. These weren't accidents. They were Anne's calculated reminders that titles could be granted, But respect had to be earned, and Anne wasn't ready to give hers. In the shadows of this tension, another alliance was taking shape. One the Queen herself had quietly encouraged. Before her passing, Elizabeth had spoken with Anne, privately, and with unmistakable urgency. Her words were simple but chilling: "Be my voice when I'm gone." And Anne, the only daughter of the monarch, took that request as sacred command. She began meeting more frequently with Catherine, quiet dinners, closed-door conversations, moments that didn't require words to be understood. The two women, bound by duty and a shared distrust of Camilla's intentions, began forging a silent alliance rooted in legacy, not ambition. Camilla, for all her instincts, sensed the shift. She began to notice the slights, the cold smiles, the clipped responses, the glaring absence of invitations she once assumed were guaranteed. There was no formal challenge, but the signals were loud. Anne was drawing lines, not just for herself, but for the monarchy as her mother had envisioned it. And for Camilla, it was infuriating. Whispers began to ripple through the palace that Anne might take her resistance public, exposing not only her personal disdain but challenging Camilla's growing authority head-on. But it wasn't until Anne revealed what she witnessed during the Queen's final days that the palace walls truly began to shake and Camilla's mask began to crack. Buried beneath duty and formality was a secret dream Queen Elizabeth held onto until her final breath that Catherine, not Camilla, would one day wear the crown beside her grandson. For all her stoic restraint, Elizabeth was not immune to vision. She understood better than anyone that the monarchy's survival depended not just on tradition, but on its ability to evolve gracefully, not forcefully. In William and Catherine, she saw more than heirs. She saw redemption, a second chance for the royal family to regain the dignity, trust, and modern relevance that had been lost in years of scandal, divorce, and missteps. Anne later revealed that her mother referred to them privately as the monarchy's rebirth, a phrase spoken not with hope, but with certainty. It was clear. Elizabeth didn't just wish it, she willed it. In subtle ways, the Queen had tried to guide the line of succession toward this vision. While never defying constitutional protocol, she hinted that the true future of the monarchy lay beyond the expected. She had faith that the public, tired of history's ghosts, would embrace a new royal couple who reflected values they actually believed in: stability, humility, and quiet strength. Camilla, however, represented something entirely different. To Elizabeth, her presence on the throne felt like a stain on the final chapter of her reign, a compromise she had tolerated, not accepted. This wasn't idle musing. Elizabeth had written private letters to Anne, letters that now sit preserved in the royal archives where she expressed grave concern over how her passing might be manipulated. "I fear," she wrote in one, "that we are preparing a coronation for the past, not the future." These weren't criticisms of her son, they were warnings about who would rise beside him. Camilla's potential reign was not something Elizabeth feared because of rivalry, but because of resonance. She believed it wouldn't resonate, not with the people, not with the crown's silent soul. What moved the Queen most about Catherine wasn't her popularity, it was her restraint. In a world that rewards noise, Catherine remained silent. In an institution that demands conformity, she gave grace. The Queen believed that leadership didn't need to roar, it needed to endure. And Catherine had endured everything: press attacks, comparisons, pressure, yet never lost her balance. Elizabeth saw that, and in her final blessing, she whispered to Anne, "She will outlast us all." When William finally learned of his grandmother's true feelings, perhaps months after her passing, he reportedly wept, not from ambition, but from the crushing weight of expectation now passed to him and his wife. It wasn't just about being king and queen, it was about becoming the monarchy's last chance to survive with meaning. And as Charles moved swiftly to elevate Camilla to queen consort, Anne and Catherine were preparing a response the palace never saw coming. The moment Camilla stepped onto the coronation platform, the division became visible even through polished smiles. But one seat was left empty, and it was no accident. In a moment meant to symbolize unity, the crown revealed its deepest fractures. The world watched as King Charles and Queen Camilla were crowned side by side. But within the royal family, the silence spoke louder than the ceremony. Princess Anne, known for her unwavering commitment to duty, refused to attend a pivotal segment of the coronation. No reason was given. No statement released. But everyone in the palace knew it was a deliberate act, a bold, unmistakable rejection of the woman her mother had never fully accepted. And then there was Catherine. The Princess of Wales stood out not for her presence, but for what she chose to wear. Her ensemble, though elegant, mirrored the look Queen Elizabeth had worn during the National Day of Mourning, a quiet but powerful symbol. It wasn't fashion, it was a message, a warning, a declaration that tradition had been buried, and the mourning wasn't just for a queen lost, but for a monarchy off course. She offered no warm glances, no unnecessary words. Her curtsy to Camilla was slight, almost mechanical. Her eyes remained fixed ahead. Every gesture that day, every subtle moment, was loaded with tension. Cold nods, missed greetings, quiet exchanges that never happened. The illusion of unity cracked beneath the weight of unspoken truths. And at the center of it all was William, trapped between the man who raised him and the woman who now embodied everything his grandmother believed the monarchy should become. Torn between loyalty to his father and loyalty to the crown's long-term survival, William wore the crown of internal conflict more visibly than any royal jewel. Behind the scenes, the divide deepened further. Camilla, now emboldened by her title, had already begun reshaping the institution. Long-standing royal charities were being restructured, patronages reallocated. Her allies, carefully placed in advisory roles, were slowly pushing forward a vision that looked less like Elizabeth's reign and more like her own personal kingdom. But what she didn't count on, what she couldn't see through the haze of applause, was the quiet rebellion building just beneath her feet. Anne and Catherine had not been idle. In hushed conversations and private strategy, they had already begun removing key figures from royal positions. Those known to be loyal to Camilla were quietly shifted out or left without renewal. Royal duties once overseen by Camilla's inner circle were reassigned. It wasn't theatrical, it wasn't loud, it was a quiet reclamation, a cleansing of the crown from within. But the real storm erupted not during the coronation, but in the days that followed. When Anne finally chose to speak the truth no one dared utter. For the first time in royal history, Princess Anne sat before cameras and shattered the monarchy's silence. Her voice was steady, but what she said left the nation stunned. No announcement, no grand production, just a chair, a quiet room, and the Princess Royal staring down the weight of generations. The interview had been arranged in secret, no palace approval, no official statement. Anne had reached her limit. For too long, she had watched the institution she vowed to protect veer off course. And now, with Camilla crowned, the truth could no longer be buried beneath protocol and pretense. What she revealed was nothing short of explosive. Anne confirmed what had long been speculated but never verified. The Queen's final meeting with Catherine was not ceremonial. It was strategic. It was desperate. It was a reckoning. With calm clarity, Anne detailed the contents of that conversation. The envelope, the vow, and the heavy fear that drove her mother to act in her final days. Elizabeth, Anne said, was tormented by a truth she dared not speak publicly, that the crown was being twisted by influence, not earned by duty. Anne did not hold back. She accused Camilla not of treason or scandal but of manipulation, of bending Charles's judgment, of subtly shifting the monarchy's center of gravity towards self-preservation, not service. Her words carried a sharp edge, controlled but unmistakably cutting. She spoke of her mother's visible pain, how the Queen confided her deepest regret was not confronting Camilla's growing shadow sooner. And for the first time, the public was allowed behind the curtain of royal unity to see the heartbreak that had festered beneath it. Within minutes of the interview airing, social media erupted. The real Queen began trending worldwide. Clips were dissected frame by frame, and public opinion, already divided, surged in one direction. Support for Catherine and Anne soared. Questions were hurled toward Clarence House, toward Charles, toward a woman now wearing a crown that, many felt, was never truly hers. Inside the palace, the silence was deafening. Camilla, upon viewing the broadcast, was reportedly devastated. Some said she cried. Others claimed she stormed out of a meeting, visibly shaken. Either way, the blow had landed. Anne's words had cracked open the stone exterior of the monarchy, exposing wounds that could no longer be ignored. And as the world reeled from the princess's truth-telling, one woman stood on the precipice of her own reckoning, because the moment had come not just for remembering Elizabeth's wishes, but for honoring them in action. Yet even with Anne's revelation, the monarchy was not done unraveling. Catherine's next move would force the palace into a full-blown crisis. The document Catherine had kept locked away for months, the one Elizabeth handed her with trembling fingers, was finally opened, and it was far more than anyone expected. It had remained hidden in silence, locked behind the veil of grief, guarded not by walls, but by honor. Catherine had carried the envelope with her through the darkest transitions of the monarchy, through Camilla's rise, through Charles's shifting court, through the storm of Anne's broadcasted defiance. But there came a moment when silence was no longer protection, it was betrayal. On the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's death, Catherine made her choice. The envelope was unsealed. The words were released, and the monarchy would never be the same. It was handwritten in the Queen's unmistakable script. The royal insignia of wax remained untouched, and the letter began not as a royal address, but as a personal farewell. But soon, it turned into something deeper, a blueprint for the soul of the crown. Elizabeth detailed her fears not of scandal, but of erosion, of dignity being traded for popularity, of ceremony replacing substance. She spoke of betrayal not from outsiders, but from within, and she warned of public disillusionment if the crown became unrecognizable to those it vowed to serve. But then came the most striking line, clear, powerful, unflinching. She named Catherine not as heir, but as moral guardian of the crown. Not because of title or bloodline, but because of what she represented. Stillness amidst noise, grace under pressure, truth in a house built on shadows. The Queen instructed her to act only when necessary, when the people need to remember who we are. And that time, Catherine now believed, had come. When the letter was released to the press, the reaction was volcanic. Headlines erupted across every continent. Commentators gasped, supporters wept, detractors scrambled. The monarchy's silence was shattered not by scandal, but by clarity. It was no longer speculation. It was the Queen's voice echoing from beyond the grave. And in those words, the public saw not division, but hope. They saw a path to a crown that could be respected again. A monarchy rooted in service, not spectacle. And as the public rallied behind the vision of a modern monarchy, it was now Charles who stood cornered, forced to choose between his wife and his legacy. With the nation divided and the monarchy under fire, it was Anne and Catherine, two women long underestimated, who rose to reclaim the soul of the crown. While the storm surrounding the Queen's final letter had barely begun to settle, the palace's internal structure was already shifting. Quietly, without spectacle or press, Camilla's influence began to dissolve. Several of her most prized patronages were reassigned, some returned to Anne, others passed discreetly to Catherine. The reshuffle was swift, surgical, and unmistakably deliberate. Camilla, still wearing her title, now stood increasingly alone, her power eclipsed not by scandal, but by resolve. William and Catherine stepped forward not just as heirs, but as representatives of a reborn monarchy. Their appearances grew more frequent, their speeches are sharper. And for the first time, Anne publicly blessed their ascent, calling them the steady hands our nation needs. It wasn't just symbolic, it was seismic. Anne, who had never endorsed anyone so openly, was making it clear the torch had passed. Not to Charles and Camilla, but to the next generation, and the vision his mother had preserved in secrecy for far too long. Then came the moment no one saw coming. The royal family held a press conference. The mood was somber, the tone uncharacteristically candid. For the first time, they addressed Queen Elizabeth's final wishes, confirming the existence of the letter, acknowledging its message, and pledging to honor it. It was an unprecedented act of transparency. And in doing so, the monarchy took its first steps out of the shadows and into a future built not on fear, but on truth. Public opinion surged. Camilla, once embraced by carefully managed image building, now faced mounting scrutiny. Commentators questioned the legitimacy of her position. Supporters of the monarchy demanded reforms. Critics found themselves outnumbered by citizens who, for the first time in years, felt seen heard by the very institution that had often kept them at arm's length. What followed was nothing short of revolutionary. Behind closed palace doors, transparency protocols were drafted, legacy reforms introduced, Plans to modernize the crown were no longer buried in whispers. They were printed, signed, and delivered. It wasn't about dismantling the past. It was about saving what was left of it on the Queen's terms. And at the center of it all stood Catherine and Anne, unshaken, unapologetic, standing not as rebels, but as restorers, the embodiment of a monarchy rooted not in entitlement, but in endurance. They didn't seize power, they honored it. They didn't demand respect, they earned it. As the crown evolves under watchful eyes, one truth remains unshaken. In her final hour, Queen Elizabeth placed her faith not in bloodlines but in character, and that decision changed everything. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.